keep out top secret places governments don't want you to know about. This is a world that is peppered with strange high security facilities. Just recently on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe and I were talking about something she has discovered on the ground in Alaska between Nome and Mount McKinley. And when you look it up on Google Earth, you find an area that has been somehow kind of blanked out, indicating there is something there that they do not want you to see. Now, there's a lot they don't want us to see. In fact, I think there's a whole civilization embedded in our world and hidden in our world that they don't want us to see. Nick, how do you react to that?
Well, I would say I have to agree with you. I think, it's often our arrogance to think, we know everything. We don't. And the more we dig into it, the more we find we know less and less. So nothing. To be honest, today nothing surprises me that we uncover.
Now, you mentioned a lot of, the book is fascinating, folks, keep out. One of the things that I found really deeply disturbing was the material about Fort Detrick. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about the Fort Detrick information?
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, it's an installation in Maryland, and it's where the government conducts most of its research into sort of biological warfare, bacteriological warfare, exotic viruses, and things like this. The ultimate sort of killer cocktails, that could be unleashed and wipe out nations, if you like. And it's a lot of sort of cutting-edge research has been done there over the decades. I mean, it actually was created in the early 1940s. It was first known as Dietrich Field, then Camp Dietrich, and then Fort Dietrich. So it's had a long, rich history. But of course, things like biological warfare, exotic viruses, manipulated and altered viruses, you're really digging into some controversial areas, and I think one of the big fears, of course, is that somebody one day is going to unleash something that's going to spread like a whirlwind around the planet which will be unstoppable, and that's one of the disturbing areas. One of the things that we know the Russians were researching, they have their own equivalent as well. One of the things we know the Russians were researching at one point was trying to create like a racial profiling virus that would literally just target certain races of people, which, is even scarier in many respects.
Yeah, very much so, especially because the targeting could actually be even more exact than that. I want to skip around a little bit here because you mentioned in both books, but in particular in Keep Out, Mac Tanis, who we both knew. Mac, I had an interesting history with Mac. Mac had published a terrific Jeremiad against me on his blog at one point, which, that doesn't necessarily mean I won't be his friend. I'm not like, I have many friends who disagree with me, or in fact, if I didn't, I probably wouldn't have all many friends at all. In any case, that as it may, there was something changed his mind. And that was that someone who I've never quite been able to track down, I've got it down to two individuals, wrote a comment on the blog. I think that if the blog is up, the comment is probably still there, to the effect that he had seen lights over my cabin on frequent occasions. Mm-hmm. And I know the person, he lived near me in upstate New York. I know the person who said this, because he said it to me too, and it then appeared in this comment. But he claims that the comment was made by another individual who lived across the road, and neither one of them will own up to having written it. So, I'm sort of left with that. But in any case, it made Mac take another look. Now, here's the thing about Mac. Mac died, folks, at the age of 34. I don't think anyone had any idea he had any illness. I don't think even Mac did. Did he?
Well, he knew something was wrong because I know that he did have a few tests. He was suffering like faintness and dizziness for a while.
That's right, but nothing had come up in the
No,
tests.
that's right, and he just literally died in his sleep one night in October 2009. And
Right.
I mean, it's a tragedy, whatever age you're going to go. But I guess if you in your sleep is the best way. But I mean, to go at 34, that's no age.
Well, tell us about what he was working on toward the end, the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. I thought it was absolutely fascinating.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was one of the things which, the biggest tragedy of all, that Mac, as a person, passed away, for his family, his parents, friends, etc. That's the biggest tragedy of all. But Mac, I think, was actually on the cusp of really becoming the sort of the definitive researcher and writer on this issue of crypto-terrestrials, that being the idea that perhaps some entities, that we perceive linked with UFOs today, don't necessarily originate, in some other faraway star system or some dimensional realm, but possibly coexist with us in stealth, and that they're the last sort of remnants of a very ancient terrestrial civilization. And Matt came up with some interesting theories. He wondered if, a lot of UFO incidents he felt were staged by these entities to try and make them look massively superior and advanced. And he wondered if really it was a lot of subterfuge where they were literally on sort of an evolutionary decline. Maybe they had a limited number of craft, but they staged events to make it look like they were, zipping around all around the world and, had fingers in every pie, so to speak. He came up with a number of interesting scenarios. One of the things in his book, The Crypto-Terrestrials, that would probably interest you is that he related one story about how this sort of creepy-looking woman came into a shop and purchased a pack of cigarettes and looked very similar to the entity on the front cover of Communion, but with sunglasses and a obviously fake blonde wig on her head. And it kind of reminded me of the Bruce Lee story. And, Max sort of wondered if, was this a crypto-terrestrial? Was it an extraterrestrial? Was it something else? But he had he developed this fascinating scenario of sort of a waning, ancient, aged society trying to cling on to its lineage, if you like, and exploiting and using us, but manipulating us and sort of living in the shadows and underground and just surfacing when they were able to, but trying valiantly to pretend they were something far more advanced and, significant than their last remnants actually were, so to speak.
Well, this... And incidentally, subscribers, if you go back to the, I believe the July 2010 Dreamlands, we talk about Mac. We never, unfortunately, got to interview him on the show, but we do. There's quite a bit about him. So you just put Tonnies, Tonnies, into our search engine, and you can go back. One of the things about this idea that it might involve something coming up from underground, which was central to Mac's thinking, is that when people would have close encounter, I did not ever notice this at my cabin, but people who had physical close encounters there would often say they stank like the forest floor. And if you dig up in a forest, and in our forest certainly, you find an odor that the soil underneath the forest does not smell sweet. It's stinky. And that odor was present when these beings were around. And I also, in order to have some of my best close encounters, would have to go down into a cave on the property. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because, we can look around at all cultures around the world and they all have stories of sort of magical ethereal entities that lived underground. Britain, where I'm originally from, a lot of the stories of the fairies, the sort of brownies and goblins, etc., they were renowned to sort of live deep underground in caves and caverns. And of course, a lot of these creatures back then, the image today of the fairy is like this sort of little female character with wings. That's not the original image that existed. They were more sort of semi-sinister, trickster-type characters that could be playful and helpful, but could also be benevolent or malevolent, as the mood struck them, and sometimes just to teach people a lesson. And they also had like an obsessive interest in human reproduction. They often stole babies and left what were known as changelings, like a crudely carved wooden effigy. So this also ties in, with this whole hybrid children angle and things like this. So, I think, and when we look at the fact that, they're also associated with underground caverns and dwellings, you have to wonder if, I actually don't wonder, I do believe that, these stories are based on a reality of some sort of unknown entity that, the ancient man recognized and knew, at least spent part of its time underground.
Yeah, and of course, in old Celtic songs, Baloo Ballery comes to mind. They're always described as the Peary fairies, and very definitely not angelic little creatures like are described nowadays. They're
not like Tinkerbell or anything like that.
No. Now, there are so many things in the book. We could go on and on and on. I want to go to the business of the secret base on the far side of the moon. That's one that I've always thought was just nonsense.
Well, yeah, a lot of people, sort of roll their eyes at the idea that there could be some sort of secret base on the far side of the moon, whether ours or extraterrestrial or possibly even both. A number of people have come forward, one of them being a man named Carl Wolf, who was with the U.S. Air Force in the 60s, and who has gone on record openly as stating that he was told by an operative from NASA at Langley that the NASA photographs have been acquired, or taken, I should say, which seem to show some sort of installation on the far side of the moon. This was in the 1960s. Now, this was sort of 4 or 5 years before, Neil Armstrong even set foot on the moon. So people inevitably say, well, there's no way it could be anything of ours because we didn't land there till 69. But if we look back at the historical record, we find that in the late 1950s, the U.S. Army initiated a secret program called Project Horizon, with the idea was to basically kind of try and militarize the moon and set up sort of like the equivalent of a South Pole outpost on the moon, which could be added to the point where eventually it would become like a prime, military base, which in the event of a nuclear attack and if America got taken out by the Russians, then, the moon outpost could launch an attack on the Soviets. That was the idea. What was interesting is that this wasn't just some sort of pipe dream. The files on Project Horizon run into thousands of pages, highly technical and scientific, and they talk about the idea of having a clandestine program to try and build the rudiments of this first base by 1965, which was the same year that Carl Wolf said NASA had photographed these strange structures on the far side of the moon. Now, of course, a lot of people say, well, NASA is, the face of space exploration. Wouldn't they know if another arm of government or the military or whoever had a clandestine space program? Well, my view is, no, they necessarily wouldn't know. It doesn't necessarily mean, that this base or whatever it was related to Project Horizon. But when we look at the time frame and what the military was trying to do, and the fact that they were operating outside of the confines of NASA and not even engaging or involving them in this discussion, you have to wonder if some of these stories are becoming more and more prevalent about there being a secret space program. It sounds like a lot of them could actually be vindicated.
Well, what I have in my ear is an implant that was put in there by two people under circumstances that were completely unmistakable. I was awake when it happened. It's no question. The object has been observed by a pathologist and by a doctor. It is not a natural object. It is a piece of technology made by unknown means. Now, to me, that tells me that I'm living proof of the existence of this breakaway civilization. Mm-hmm. So it exists. There are people out there with technologies that are far beyond what the rest of us have. And so to me, it could be true. It could easily be true. We're better to operate from if you're uh, if you want to deal with Earth on a large scale, you can hide back there so easily. Of course, now you can't, but you could then. But let's go on. One of the things that we studied years ago was the Dulce base. I sent a reporter there, and he didn't find anything completely convincing about the base itself. But what he did find that the tribe, the Jicarilla Apaches who lived around Archuleta Mesa, where the base is allegedly located, have a legend that they were created by someone inside the mesa. And also, they have a constant smattering of cattle mutilations in the area. Tell us what you found out about it.
Yeah, I mean, the Dulce story is a fascinating one because, number one, it's so controversial. People, take the notion, well, it just couldn't be true. The idea that there's this sort of deep subterranean base constructed deep within the mesa and possibly, where the hostile aliens or whatever these things are dwell. And it's basically off limits not just to the general public, but to the U.S. government as well. The sort of the keep out message extends to everybody, and even the government sort of afraid to sort of set foot in there. Now, people say, well, that's just not possible. But when we dig into the story of Dulce and also the immediate area surrounding the mesa itself, the Archuleta Mesa, we find a lot of very strange things have gone on in the past. For example, back in the 1960s, the U.S. Department of Energy embarked on a program called Project Gas Buggy, and the idea was to detonate deep underground large explosive devices, and the idea was to provoke the release of natural gas, which would then be used as a form of energy. It so happens that one of these gas buggy experiments was actually undertaken only 10 miles from Dulce in an area of forest land today. If you go out there, there are signs warning you not to dig underground in that area. And, again, otherwise, it's a penalty against the law. So, on the one hand, we have people saying, well, there's nothing underground in this area at all. You just drive 10 miles from Dulce and you find Department of Energy signs warning you under no circumstances will you dig underground, in this area. So some people have speculated that maybe, and this gets into controversial areas, but what if instead of this sort of massively explosive device being detonated to try and unleash natural gas, what if it was a panicky attempt by the government to actually destroy something they knew existed deep underground, or infect it with some, virus or something like that. On top of that, a few years ago, the FBI released into the public domain a couple of 100 pages of files on its research into cattle mutilations. What's interesting is that most of those files date from the 1970s, 75 to about 79, and the vast majority of them all revolve around cattle mutilations in the Dulce area. And there are countless New Mexico State Police reports in there. Even Henry Monteith, who was someone who took a deep interest in Vimanas in the ancient mysteries of the past, he's mentioned in the files. So, we have this picture where the government says, well, there's nothing at Dulce, but then we find, there are exploding underground devices in the area, warning people even to this day to keep away. And the FBI was studying cattle mutilations in that very same area for years. So all this to me suggests, we should be looking for the answers here. Something strange is going on. Maybe some of the stories are disinformation and exaggerated to confuse the truth.
Well, right.
With all this that is going on, the onus is on us to investigate it.
And will you?
Oh, yes. I mean, I've been there a couple of occasions and, spoke to the locals and, I've been to the Mesa. What I haven't had the opportunity to do, unfortunately, is sort of large-scale climb it, etc., and, sort of check it out in that sense. But, in terms of actually going to the area and speaking to people, I've done that on a couple of occasions because I always feel that, if you're going to investigate something like this, the Internet can be a great resource tool, but, there's still no real alternative or better alternative than speaking to somebody face to face where they know,
That's correct.
You get that image and that sense you can trust each other, you know.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons you're here, is because you do a lot of that, and a lot of the researchers are strictly armchair, and some of them come up with great stuff, but don't get me wrong, but I really always prefer to talk to people who actually go there, do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly room, you know, and there'll always be room for, research done on the internet or whatever, or in libraries. But I think, you know, to find a lot of these answers, particularly when we go into a place that's like static, like an installation, then inevitably, you know, you're going to have to try and get out there, so to speak. So.
Now, one of the things that kind of surprised me in the book, I don't know why it should have, but it did, was the material about the Vatican. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Vatican, you know, and Vatican City, that whole area is sort of steeped, not just obviously in religion, but, you know, deep mystery and folklore, ancient history, a lot of ancient secrets, you know, and powerful people, etc., etc. One of the things we know for sure, and this is sort of a long-standing story which has a lot of controversy attached to it, but also a lot of testimony and even declassified documents today, is that back during the Second World War, and Adolf Hitler, you know, when he was sort of taking on pretty much the entire world, he came up with a lot of sort of new and novel and alternative ways to sort of fund the Nazi war machine. And one of those ways was basically to secure for the Nazis, you know, a whole range, I mean, just mountains of ancient relics and, you know, priceless artifacts from the past, paintings, you know, ancient treasures, that sort of thing, and use that as funding. And that's what happened. But when the sort of Nazi war machine began to sort of spiral down in the final stages of the war, a lot of astute Nazis basically sort of, you know, fled the coop, so to speak, and took a lot of this material with them, you know, which is highly valuable, and actually sought out people in the Vatican who, you know, for sort of safekeeping, not just of these material evidence, etc., and these priceless artifacts, but their own safekeeping as well. You know, sort of like doing a deal to remain hidden, so to speak. And what we know is that a lot of these ancient artifacts and priceless relics made their way to the Vatican, and in the immediate post-war era, sort of 1945, 46, 47, a lot of research was done by various arms of the U.S. government to try and find where all this priceless material had gone, that the Allies knew the Nazis had acquired but had seemingly vanished. And a lot of the threads pointed back to the Vatican and tales of massive, deep underground vaults below Rome, etc., where all this material was reportedly held. And of course, you know, the stories were sort of summarily denied, apart from the things that are now on display. But, you know, the American intelligence dug into this very deeply to a point where, you know, aside from the denial, all the evidence points to these sort of vast catacombs and tunnels and all this material possibly still even being held there to this day.
So, you know, you go there and you always think there's more to this place than I am being allowed to see, and probably a great deal more. Nick, we're getting toward the end of our time together. I'd like to go to Pine Gap. Because, as you state in the book, it is probably one of the most secret places on Earth. There's also a road nearby called the Alien Highway, because people see so many UFOs up and down this road. And in addition, I believe there was a shuttle mission that was approached by by little objects, and then something came up like a pulse of light from below and drove them all away, and this pulse of light came from Pine Gap, from the area of Pine Gap.
Yeah, Pine Gap's an interesting place. It's not too far from Alice Springs in Australia, and of course a lot of these places are chosen for either their sort of remoteness or, you know, the fact that they're isolated, you know, which sort of typifies Pine Gap. It's basically like an Australian equivalent of the U.S. National Security Agency. In other words, it's like Australia's eavesdropping agency on the world. You know, they monitor everything from emails to electronic communications, faxes, phone calls. You know, they're basically the electronic eyes and ears of Australia. And Pine Gap is, you know, a highly fortified, secretive installation. It also has a permanent contingent of NSA personnel stationed there. You know, people have moved over from from the US to Australia and live and work at the base, or live in the area, I should say, and work at the base. But you're quite right. What's interesting is that Pine Gap has had like an extensive, long history of sightings of UFOs. There actually is one famous story of people reportedly seeing what looked like sort of ground-level doorways sort of slide horizontally open, if you like, and this UFO-type object rise up and take to the skies. Now, one of the things I think about, the UFO phenomenon today is that the more our technology advances, there's going to be more and more of a problem between differentiating between what's, quote, their UFOs and our UFOs. And I think sometimes when these things are seen in the vicinity of places like Pine Gap, I do wonder if they could be occasionally, sort of highly advanced, sophisticated drone technologies, whether ours or somebody else's, but, in some cases ours, precisely because they're seen at a sensitive installation. But, that doesn't explain, obviously, a tremendous body of additional stories. So, I think we could be looking at some military highly advanced craft being developed and flown from these places. But if historically we look back into history, we find even, back in the 40s and 50s, very, very good examples of outright penetrations of military installations in the U.S. by objects that were clearly not anything we were flying back then. These were sort of intrusions by something else. So I think, we can apply both scenarios to these secret bases like Pine Gap.
Well, exactly. And a place like Pine Gap, it's also an enormous communications center. The U.S. National Reconnaissance Office got extraordinary equipment, apparently, at Pine Gap. I want to ask you, Nick, before we go, is there anything we haven't covered that you were thinking we should have covered?
Not really. I mean, we can talk about secret bases all day long because pretty much every advanced country on the planet has them,
What would you say is probably the least known of the secret bases that you talk about in the book?
I would probably say actually some of the Russian ones, where you have these stories about, for example, in the Ural Mountains and in the Caucasus Mountains, stories of massive installations reportedly built, with these sort of heavy penetrating drilling devices, possibly, down to depths of like 1,000 feet, where the rumors coming out are that, these installations can house literally tens of thousands of people in the event of a national emergency, with food, with sort of purified water, with recirculated air, etc., for, months at a time. And the National Reconnaissance Office actually prepared a report a few years ago how they recognized that some of these installations were being hastily modified in the last few years, which sort of opens up another can of worms as to why. But certainly these Russian installations, I think, are the ones that are most intriguing because they're the ones we hear snippets of, but nothing sort of really, definitive beyond the fact that they do exist. So.
Nick Redfern, thank you very much for being with us. NickRedfern.com. Keep out top secret places the government does not want you to know about. And on Dreamland, Top Secret, the Pyramids, and the Pentagon. Well worked out and researched, most interesting books. Nick,
thanks, Willie.
What are you working on right now, if I may ask before we go?
Yeah, sure. New Page Books, who publish both the Pyramids of the Pentagon and Keep Out, asked me if I was interested in doing a book to be titled The World's Weirdest Places, which comes out later this year. And it was basically, they suggested, why don't you write a chapter on each of your favorite weird places around the world, which seem almost like paranormal hotspots, like window areas, as John Keel used to call them. So I picked
Jim Mars's place.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good one.
They live fairly close together, folks.
Yeah, not too far away. So I've kind of picked my favorite 25 places around the world, and that'll be out towards the end of this year, something like that.
Nick, thank you so much, as always, for being with us.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Whitley.